This is chapter 2 of Occupied America by Rodolfo Acuña, the occupation of Middle America. What drove the conquest? Spain's occupation of Mesoamerica violently disrupted the latter's evolution, destroying Mesoamerican social institutions, religion, and infrastructure. Within 80 years, 1519 through 1600, the native population fell from at least 25 million to about a million. From what followed was 300 years of colonial rule, accompanied by political and economic exploitation and the categorization of people by color and the projection of the dominant class's worldview. It pulled Spain and ultimately all of Europe out of the Dark Ages and allowed them to buy into a world market dominated by China. The Asian market's demand for silver in the early 1500s contributed to the growth of mining districts such as Zacatecas. In the early 1500s, the gold silver ratio was 1 to 6 in China. In Europe, it hovered around 1 to 12. In Persia, 1 to 10, and in India, 1 to 8. Thus, with 6 ounces of silver, merchants could buy a full ounce of gold in China. In Europe, the same 6 ounces had a purchasing power of 1/2 ounce of gold. This trade put a premium on silver. In 1571, the Spaniards founded the city of Manila, Philippines, and it became a global center of substantial and continuous trade across the Pacific Ocean. Through the 17th century, Pacific galleons transported more than 50 tons in silver annually from Acapulco to Manila, where Chinese merchants would ship the cargo to the mainland. Trade with the Orient pushed demand for Mexican bullion as the Chinese population zoomed from 55 million in 1500 to 231 million in 1600 and 268 million in 1650. By the next century, the Chinese comprised more than 1/3 of the world's population. Zacatecas in the northern periphery of New Spain depended on the demand for silver in the Orient. Africa begins at the prairies. French novelist and playwright Alexandre Dumas, 1802 to 1870, wrote Africa begins at the prairies. Iberia, modern-day Spain and Portugal, was much more a part of ancient glories that were Phoenicia, Carthage, Greece, Rome, and the Muslim world that it was of Western Europe. The intermingling of the races began in about 35,000 BC. By 5000 BC, the Basque people lived in the north, in the Pyrenees region. Between 4000 and 3500 BC, the Iberians entered from North Africa. The Celtics arrived through the Pyrenees from 900 to 650 BC, bringing knowledge of iron metallurgy. Around 1100 BC, Phoenician merchants from present-day Lebanon established trading posts in Candiz and elsewhere along the Spanish coast. Greeks traded along the northeastern coast, and Jewish merchants from North Africa settled on the Iberian Peninsula. The Phoenician colony of Carthage in what is modern day Tunisia, rose in power and displaced the Lebanese Phoenicians. Iberia came under the rule of Carthage, but Rome displaced it following the Punic Wars, 234 to 246 BC, laying the foundations for Spanish language and culture. Following the, following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, the Visigoths, a Germanic people from Central Europe, ruled Spain. In 1711, the Muslims of northern Africa launched an invasion across the Straits of Gibraltar, occupying most of the peninsula. The African presence lasted more than 7 centuries. Under Muslim rule, Spain was a center of learning and art. The Muslims preserved the writings of many Greek, Roman, and Middle Eastern intellectuals, writings that otherwise surely would have been lost. Muslims brought improved irrigation methods, food strains, oranges and other fruits and vegetables, rice, sugar cane, and cotton. The Africans also brought other breeds of animals, using stock from the Muslims and Moors. The Spaniards developed a better breed of horse, which they adapted to an arid climate. They developed strategies to travel long distances, herding African cattle and churro sheep. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms to the north reigned power in holy wars known as La Reconquista, the reconquest, driving the Moors out. By the 1000s, Christians were gaining an upper hand, and by the 1200s, they had driven out the Muslims into the Granada region of the peninsula. In 1479, the marriage of Queen Isabella and King Fernando united the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and in 1492 they conquered the last Moorish kingdom, Granada, the eastern half of present-day Andalusia. That same year they expelled between 120,000 and 150,000 Spanish Jews. These events set the stage for occupied America. The Spanish Conquest. Who was this man, Cristobal Colon, or Christopher Columbus? He is claimed by Italians, Jews, Spaniards, and Catalans. No one really knows. DNA tests are being conducted at this very moment. As linguists examine his writings, the only ones who do not claim Columbus are the Native Americans, who prefer to call him Colon with a small c and without an accent mark. What is pertinent to this narrative? In 1492, Columbus landed in what are now the islands of the Caribbean. When he could not find sufficient gold and wealth, he turned to trading in slaves. By 1495, he rounded up 1,500 Dianos, Arawaks, selected 500 of the best specimens, and set sail for Spain. Only 300 of those natives survived the trip. Because of the Spanish conquest, by 1650, few Tainos or Caribs, who occupied most of the Lesser Antilles, the Virgin Islands, and Vices Island, remained alive. By the early 1500s, sugar-growing plantations emerged on the islands. The plantation system was not new to Columbus. The Arabs had initiated it on the Mediterranean islands of Cyprus and Sicily, and it required an immense captive labor force of African slaves. By the 1440s, the Portuguese, through raid and trade techniques, expanded down the West African coast. When the Spaniards decimated the native populations, much the same as the Portuguese did on the Atlantic islands, the Azores, the Canaries, the Cape Verdes Islands, Sao Tome, and Madeira, they too imported African slaves. Columbus had trained in the Madeira sugar trade. On his second voyage of 1493, he introduced sugar cane plants to the Caribbean. Columbus knew that sugar and slavery were inseparable and that tremendous profits could be gotten from sugar. By the early 16th century, the sugar industry thrived on Santo Domingo, then on Cuba, and soon after on Puerto Rico. Simultaneously, the Spaniards almost wiped out the native population through warfare, overwork, and disease. The Pope condemned the Portuguese practice of the plunder and enslavement of human beings along the coast of Africa. However, he left a loophole. The natives could be enslaved if they were cannibals. Columbus himself justified the enslavement of the indigenous people, claiming they were cannibals. The Spaniards repeated this pretext throughout the colonial period. In Central America, they captured and sold tens of thousands of natives as slaves. They shipped Nicaragua's natives to Peru to work in the mines and haciendas, plantation-like estates. Faith versus rationality. Apologists for Columbus say that he did not invent the institution of slavery. They say that Spain tried to control slavery and that the crown promulgated the laws of Burgos in 1512 that included regulations protecting indigenous labor and ensuring their Christianization. They argue that Domingos Antonio de Mostecinos and Bartolome de las Casas vigorously defended the rights of the Native Americans. But the laws of Burgos were almost never enforced, and the famed national debates over whether or not the natives had rational souls did not occur until 6 decades after the initial contact in the Caribbean and 3 decades after the fall of the Azteca Empire. The debate between Bartolome de las Casas and the renowned Spanish scholar Juan Gines de Sepulveda took place in 1550-1551 in Valladolid, Spain. Sepulveda based his arguments on Aristotle's doctrine of natural slavery, that one part of mankind is set aside by nature to be slaves in the service of masters, born for a life of virtue free of manual labor. Sepulveda wrote a treatise justifying war against the natives. According to him, the Spaniards had the right to rule the barbarians because of their superiority. He compared the natives to wild beasts. The judges in the debate never reached a decision as to the validity of the arguments of Sepulveda or Las Casas. The Spanish invasion of the Mexica. The Spaniards slowly explored the Caribbean coastline of Middle America, gathering information. By 1511, the invaders conquered Cuba, and in the late 1500s, Hernán Cortés landed on the mainland that was to become Mexico. On the island of Cozumel, Cortés encountered the Maya. In 1519, Cortés sailed to what today is Veracruz, and within 2 years, Cortés's forces conquered the great Azteca Empire and began the colonization of what they later called New Spain. Throughout the advance to the Azteca capital of Tenochtitlan, gunpowder, horses, snarling dogs, and glistening armor helped the Spaniards. Unlike the invaders, the indigenous warriors did not intend to kill their enemies, hoping to wound and capture and use them as sacrifices to the gods. The Azteca also stopped fighting periodically to remove their dead and wounded from the battlefield. At close range, the natives used wooden clubs ridged with razor-sharp obsidian, vicious weapons against the indigenous people, but weapons that shattered against Spanish helmets. The double-bladed swords of the Spaniards in close combat slashed left and right, killing or maiming. Their armament allowed them to drive directly at warriors clustered around their leaders, while the Spaniards captured or killed a local chief. The chief's warriors fell back. In the Battle of Tenochtitlan, the weaponry gave the Spaniards a strategic advantage over the Azteca. The Azteca were not immune to smallpox or other European diseases, so outbreaks of these diseases had the effect of germ warfare. At a critical moment, when it seemed as if the Azteca might drive out, excuse me, as a critical moment when it seemed as if the Azteca might drive out Cortez's men, a smallpox epidemic and ravaged the native population. The colonization of native Mesoamerica. After the conquest of the Azteca, the Spaniards, through looting and torturing, conquered the Tarasco. They executed Gazanosi, the Tarascan ruler, by dragging him through town behind a horse and burning him at the stake. Cortez's men also subdued the natives of Oaxaca, but the conquest of the Maya proved more arduous. Many Maya fled to the dense forest and remained out of the control of the Spaniards for 200 years. Smallpox and other plagues. The distinguishing characteristic of the subjugation of the Mesoamerican native populations was its genocidal proportion. The term genocide is used here because when people lose 90% plus of their population, millions of lives, an explanation must be forthcoming. As with a nuclear disaster, saying it was accidental is no excuse. After the conquest of Tenochtitlan, smallpox and other epidemics spread throughout the countryside, subsiding and recurring, until eventually as many as 24 million died in what is Mexico. Certainly, the smallpox, measles, and influenza outbreaks hit urban areas hardest because of the population concentration. These three diseases are highly communicable, meaning being transmitted mainly by air. There were 4 major epidemics in the first 60 years of Spanish occupation. Smallpox caused the first epidemic of 1520 to 1521, the second year after Spanish contact. Azteca medicine could not stop its spread, and untold thousands died. The second epidemic of smallpox, possibly combined with measles, broke out in 1531. The Azteca called it Tepiton Nazahualtul, the little leprosy. The third epidemic began in 1545 and lasted 3 years. The Azteca called this Cocolitzitili, or pest, though today to have been hemorrhagic fever. Ooh. A fourth epidemic, named Cocolitzili, lasted from 1576 to 1581, and an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 Native Americans died of it in New Spain. Apologists argue that it was the Indians' predisposition to diseases that made them vulnerable to European diseases. They theorized that the native peoples were vulnerable to these diseases because their slow trek across the Bering landmass more than 50,000 years before created a biologic sector and cold screen that eliminated harmful bacteria and viruses from the body. A more plausible explanation is that the lack of larger sized domesticated animals shielded the natives from diseases carried by animals. The introduction of domestic animals, accordingly, contributed to the spread of diseases to the natives. The Columbian exchange refers to widespread exchange of animals, plants, culture, human populations that included slavery, communicable disease, and ideas between Spain and the New World. Some put a positive spin on the enrichment that occurred in these areas. However, they forget the cost in lives and the destruction of cultures. They forget about the Atlantic slave trade, the enslavement of Indians, and the diseases that killed millions of Native Americans. The Spaniards brought gunpowder, the horse, and the Catholic Church to the Americas. The Americas, as part of the exchange, sent corn, the potato, the tomato, peppers, pumpkins, squash, pineapples, cacao beans for chocolate, and the sweet potato and animals such as turkeys. The Europeans brought livestock such as cattle, pig, and sheep, and grains such as wheat. They brought the onion, citrus fruits, bananas, coffee beans, olives, grapes, rice, and sugar cane from other parts of the world, but they also brought smallpox, influenza, malaria, measles, typhus, and syphilis, and their exchange wiped out the indigenous peoples' religions, submerged their languages, and tried to blank out their history. It introduced a European construct of race that lasts to this day. The conquest of race and labor in Mesoamerica. The conquerors practiced a scorched earth strategy, causing widespread environmental destruction and social disorganization. Large numbers of displaced, oriented, and depressed refugees roamed the countryside, suffering severe nutritional deficiency and often starving to death. Illness often prevented many natives from caring for their crops or from processing corn into tortillas. The acute food shortage resulted in starvation, and contaminated food and water spread other diseases. Meanwhile, the Spaniards forcibly herded natives into new farming schemes. Alcoholism took an additional toll with the distilling of native drinks. Before the invasion, pique, which was low in alcohol content and rich in vitamins, was used for religious purposes. It resembled beer rather than hard liquor. When the Spaniards introduced distilled alcohol, it became an escape, and addiction was common. Urban resettlement plans were only reinforced substantial crowd and lack of hygiene, and native centers became breeding grounds for epidemics. Indigenous labor. A viceroy or vice king governed New Spain, ruling the colonial government that was subdivided into smaller administrative units. The crown gave more conquistadores, meaning leaders of the Crusades, encomiendas, large tracts of land with native subjects, an institution that was established in Spain during the Reconquista and also used in the Caribbean islands. The encomendero received tribute from a village along with Indian labor. In principle, encomendos would protect the natives under their care and supervise their conversion to Catholicism. In reality, the conquerors often maltreated and abused the natives, keeping them in a state of serfdom. Theory versus practice. Throughout the colonial period, Spain passed legislation supposedly to protect the natives. In theory, the laws of Burgos, passed in 1512, as recopilation de las leyes de los Reinos de las Indias, compilation royals of the royal laws of the Indies, protected the natives. Spain strengthened the laws in 1542, eliminating the right of encomenderos to unlimited use of indigenous labor. However, occasionally, the natives successfully sued. Some used the laws to protect their lands or personal labor. However, there was a difference between what the law said and how it was enforced. Justice rarely went beyond an occasional victory in the courts. The Spanish crown abolished indigenous slavery and the encomienda in the 1550s. Yet they flourished on the peripheries and frontiers of New Spain well into the 19th century. The repartamento, requiring a native community to provide labor for public projects, agriculture, and mines, and as carriers of goods, was practiced into the 18th century. Although the system made wages for the natives mandatory, the employers often ignored the provision. The repartimiento was not limited to labor. It also included the requirement that natives purchase goods from Spanish authorities. Structural controls. The native communities endured the catastrophes of the invasion and colonization of Mesoamerica, but not before Spaniards dramatically changed them. In order to control them, colonial authorities grouped native communities into municipos, townships. The largest town of the municipos was the cabecera, or the head community. While this structure led to the survival of the native community, it strengthened colonial control of the native village. The purpose was to isolate natives in order for them to identify with the local village rather than forming class or ethnic identities. This division made it difficult for the different communities to unite against Spanish rule, destroying inter-community regional networks and the pre-invasion world system. This concentrated power in the hands of Indiscaigues chiefs who ran the local system and were loyal to the Spaniards. The Spaniards allowed the indigenous peoples to retain their languages, but Spanish was the official language. The official government business was conducted in Spanish. If not the native or the casta of mixed race spoke Spanish, he or she was considered superior to those who did not. The Catholic Church was the state religion, and the Christian God supplemented the indigenous gods. The paternalism of the Spanish Furriers was racist, and they saw the natives as being childlike. They believed that the natives lacked the spiritual and mental capacity to understand Catholicism. During the early colonial period, the Spanish crown did not allow natives to become priests or nuns. The religious conquest that administered from Spain, most members of the hierarchy were on the peninsula. The monarchy and the church were one with the crown appointing the bishops, a right generally reserved to the Pope. Influenced by the Spanish Reconquista, they were intolerant and hostile toward any person who was not Catholic. To hold office or be a noble, the nominee was required to prove a limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. That is, that they were not of Jewish or Moorish blood. The intolerance extended to Spain's colonies. To further consolidate its power, Spain imposed a caste system based on race that designated an individual's rank according to color. Spanish priests listed racial classification on baptismal certificates. There were four main categories of race: the peninsular or Spaniard born in Spain, the Criollo, a person of Spanish descent born in Mesoamerica, the Indio or native, and the Negra, of African slave descent. Innumerable subcategories of hybrids developed over time. This complex system used for social control lasted in various forms throughout the colonial period, although it became more difficult to keep track of one's class position as the castas, those of mixed race, moved north. Distance allowed them to fudge on their race. The advantage of moving up in race is obvious. The more Spanish one looked and claimed to be, the more privileges the person enjoyed. Women in colonial Mesoamerica. During the colonial period, Creole culture, literally built on the ruins of the indigenous past, flourished. Although there were women such as Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, 1651-1695, an intellectual whose genius was suppressed because of her gender. In this section, we focus on a discussion of women from the indigenous classes on whose backs society had the luxury of the department of the arts. From riches extracted from the labor of the Indian, colonial society could afford to produce literature and the arts, giving birth to geniuses like Sor Juana. As important as the expressions of Creole women were to colonial Mexican society, and as outstanding as the writings of Sor Juana are, we focus on the women from the indigenous classes. For any discussions on women in this period depends greatly on ethnicity and class. This caveat also applies to males during the colonial period, whose genius was possible because of the labor and often the exploitation of others. The change in roles of women. The social and economic roles of women carried between pre-colonial and colonial societies. Women who were victims of rape, the ultimate symbol of subordination, and the economy Women were the victims of rape, the ultimate symbol of subordination, and the economy opened only limited opportunities for them. In Yucatan, the introduction of sheep led to the commercial production of wool. Women were generally responsible for making woolen goods, thus allowing their participation in the wool trade. This was not entirely positive since the repetition motions in textile work resulted in physical alignments. Azteca women were recognized as adults. They had rights before the law and society, although this status varied greatly according to their class. Under Spanish rule, their standing was weakened, although Spanish law varied greatly according to their class. Under Spanish rule, their standing was weakened, although Spanish law allowed them to litigate inheritance and land rights in court. Nahua women took advantage of these rights, and they actively litigated and testified on their own behalf in the colonial courts. This activity became less frequent in the 17th century as Nahua husbands and fathers increasingly represented the women in courts. Native women were not always recognized as hijas del pueblo, daughters or citizens of the town, with communal land rights. Women's rights to property narrowed under colonialism, and their participation changed as commercial agriculture put pressure on los de abajo, the poor and the powerless, to abandon or sell their land. Institutionalizing inequality. Before the arrival of the Spaniards, women generally married when they were about 20 years of age. After the arrival of the Spaniards, however, church friars encouraged females to marry at 12 to 14. Early reproduction often resulted in health disorders, including anemia. Society was patriarchal, and men received preferential treatment and nutrition. Even in death, men received favored treatment, as they were more likely than women to be buried within the church courtyard. In some, the colonization worsened the status of women and increased violence towards them. The family structure also changed during the colonial period. For a time, the native nobility kept much of their prestige, but the colonization led to the breakdown of the traditional indigenous family framework, which was based on an extended family rather than highly patriarchal nuclear family that the Spaniards favored. According to Tarmac and his colleagues, colonial authorities believed that the Indians would be easier to supervise and control if divided into small nuclear households, which they not only reduced the authority of the elders, but also removed the support network for women within the clan. Early marriage also influenced gender relations and increased the power of the male within the nuclear family, reducing the reducing the authority of native women within the clan. The age difference between male and female spouses favored the male. A 20-year-old male who married a 14-year-old girl held much more power than he would if both were 20 years old. The assimilation of native women. Native women, according to some sources, experienced a diminished participation in traditional and social domains. The Catholic Church promoted rigid attitudes toward women, making women the scapegoats for its failures in converting the natives. Priests blamed Indian mothers for not assimilating their children, although little attention was paid to educating Indian women and children. There were few religious schools for women in colonial society. By contrast, during the pre-conquest period, women worked as marketers, doctors, artisans, and priests, and perhaps occasionally as rulers. The opportunities for life outside the home were based on class. Native noble women who married the conquerors and brought a dowry were more readily assimilated and acculturated than the poor. The myth of passivity. Native women were anything but passive or invisible. However, by the end of the 18th century, they accounted for one-third of the Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City, workforce. Tenochtitlan had become the capital of New Spain and was renamed Mexico City. A sizable number of native African and mixed-race women worked outside the home in Mexico City. 46% of native women and 36% of women from Las Castas mixed races engaged in work outside the home, whereas only 13% of the Spanish or Criollas worked outside the home in the labor force. Most women found employment as domestic servants. We can deduce that native women and women from the castas formed the menial work, while middle-class women pursued some education. Native women were also far more docile. Legal documents show many examples of resistance. Take the case of Josefa Maria Francisca, a cacica, or noblewoman, who for some 30 years played a leading role in Tepoztlan, near Cuernavaca. Francisca did not know how to read or write and probably was unable to speak Spanish. Nevertheless, her fiery temperament made her a respected ally and a feared opponent. What angered Francisca was the repartimiento, which forcefully took the village's men to the hated mines of Taxco. In 1725, when authorities arrested repartimiento workers, she led an assault on the jail and freed them. In September, a group of 100 women broke into sacristy, liberated the ornaments and vestments, and sold them to pay for litigation. Angelina Maria Francisco, the wife of Miguel Francisco, Francisco's lover for 30 years, led the revolts, and authorities sentenced her to 1 year in an obraje, a sweatshop, and 6 months at the Hospital de Indios. They later commuted her sentence. In the winter of 1797-1798, as typhus ravaged the Maya village of Ichil, the women feared that the royal administrators would tax the village based on its pre-epidemic population. The fact that Spanish authorities violated the tradition of burying local Maya within the church compound and ordered that typhus victims be buried outside the church boundaries infuriated them. The Maya women locked the doctor and the priest in the church and made their release contingent on proper interment of the deceased. Though out of the colonial period, women lodged complaints against clergy for sexual improprieties. This was no small feat, considering they were appealing to a patriarchal structure. Ancient of social control or liberator. For many Mexicans today, the appearance of Virgen de Guadalupe is an indigenous person is proof of the church's benevolence. For others, Guadalupe is the symbol of Spanish social control, representing a passive female role model subservient to male authority. According to critics, the supposed appearance of the Virgen Mother to Juan Diego at Tepeyac in 1531 is an example of a substitution by church authorities of the Virgin of Guadalupe for the indigenous goddess Donatzin, Mother of Gods. Like many narratives, the story of the Virgen de Guadalupe may be the product of the invention of tradition rather than historical fact. Today, however, the Virgen de Guadalupe has become a Chicana cultural expression that gives strength to women and unifies and defines Mexican culture. For many, she has become a liberator, a symbol of hope and liberation for her community. Sandra Cisneros and Gloria Anzaldúa have underscored the indigenous roots of the Virgin and her symbol as a source of inspiration. Vincentio Father Stafford Poe, CM, in his book Our Lady of Guadalupe, traces the making of the peoples of the Mexican tradition of Guadalupe based on documents produced in the colonial period. According to Poe's evidence, most authorities and priests did not know about the Tepeyac shrine representing the Virgin's appearance for some 20 years after the Virgin supposedly appeared to Juan Diego. Spaniards confused her with the medieval Spanish Lady of Guadalupe shrine in Extremadura, Spain, and venerated the Virgin. Not until the 17th century, when the Creole population began to celebrate her, did she become popular among native populations. Indigenous peoples during this time greatly identified with local religious symbols, which had played a central role in the development of their own religious practices. Consequently, by the mid-1600s, the church was able to baptize most natives in central Mexico. Far from beginning about a native spontaneous upsurge, however, during the 16th and 17th centuries, Guadalupe was more a symbol of Creole nationalism than an Indian icon, according to Poe. He argues that even the story of the apparition appears to have changed during the colonial era, as did the tradition itself. Until Father excuse me. Until the Virgen de Guadalupe, He argues that even the story of the apparition appears to have changed during the colonial era, as did the tradition itself, until Father Miguel Hidalgo used her as a symbol of Mexican independence in 1810. Today, the Virgen de Guadalupe has taken on different dimensions, symboling for many Mexicans and Latin Americans a renewal and rebirth as a people. Guadalupe stands for both transformation and continuity in Mexican and religious and national life. Al Norte. God glory, silver, and slaves. The Spaniards sent expeditions from colonial Mexico in every direction, searching for riches. A Cuban based